Hey, all you cool cat and kittens. Welcome to your last World History virtual learning lecture. We're going to look at the end of the Cold War, and I know that you're all really sad, but this is your last video with me giving you notes. So, let's do this. So, make sure that you have your, that's not right, end of the Cold War note sheet pulled up, and let's do this. Okay. Making a video. What's up? Sorry about that. So, end of the Cold War. Here we go. Uh, let's review your Cold War web quest that you did earlier this week. What conflicts occurred during the Cold War that proved that it wasn't so cold? This is a really important question because this is going to be the basis for your summative that you'll be doing next week. You're going to tell me in a short written response why the Cold War wasn't really that cold. It gets the name Cold War because remember when we talk about hot versus Cold War implies there's no actual conflict. We've been arguing that yes, there is conflict, it's just not direct conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. But as you can see, between Uncle Sam and the bear, which represents Russia and the Soviet Union, you can see they've got like their pawn pieces and they're playing the game and they're trying to pit each other's like team members against each other. So let's look at some examples of it's getting hot in here, it's heating up during this Cold War conflict. There's lots of them, and if we were in school, we would do way more than just these four, but we're going to pick these four as examples of the Cold War getting hotter. The Korean War, Cuban Missile Crisis, Vietnam War, and Afghanistan. So I'm going to go through and briefly try to explain each one so that you can use these as your examples for the summative writing that you'll do next week. Okay, I'm going to take my little picture off so you can see the whole slide. I also move a lot when I'm talking, and you might find that distracting. Okay, so Korean War. So, for the Korean War, following World War II, Korea gets divided into two. Korea is a peninsula. Look it up on a map if you're not sure what I'm talking about. And basically, just like Germany gets divided, Korea gets divided too. It gets divided at the same place it's divided today, the 38th parallel. And the Soviets set up a communist government in the north, and then the Western powers, just like how we did with Germany, United States, France, and Great Britain, they set up a democracy in the south. Okay? And then this turns into a war, and the Cold War gets hot when the North, so with Soviet Union supplies, attacks the South, invades the South. And this happens in 1950. So North Korea actually invades, in an effort of war, invades South Korea. And this is U.S. policy of containment, putting it to the test, just like the Berlin airlift did. Saying, okay, the communists are trying to spread communism. What are we going to do about it? And the United States decided to send troops to South Korea to help them fight the North communists, and they were successful at pushing them back. They made it all the way up to China. And then eventually it ends in a stalemate at the 38th parallel. So it ends where it began 3 years later in 1953 with a ceasefire that actually still exists today. Technically, the Korean War never officially ended. There's no official peace treaty. That war is an ongoing war, technically, even though there hasn't been fighting since 1953. So that border between North and South Korea is heavily armed right now, and it's a pretty dangerous place to visit. In the end, the United States lost not quite 40,000 troops. Maybe you have know of a family member that fought, maybe a grandpa or a great grandpa that fought in that war, and over 500,000 Koreans died in that conflict as well. So that's an example of the Cold War wasn't so cold because that's an actual hot war where the United States lost thousands of people trying to fight communism. They didn't directly fight the Soviets, but they did fight communism. And those communists, those North Koreans, were using Soviet Union weapons. So we were indirectly fighting the Soviet Union. Okay, next example, Cuban Missile Crisis. Cuba is an island about 90 miles off of the tip of Florida. Again, look it up on a map if you're not sure. So this is a place where communism is going to come really close to home, and it's really going to freak the United States out. So basically, Cuba undergoes a revolution where they become a communist country. Fidel Castro becomes their leader. It's a dictatorship of the Communist Party, not democracy. The United States is like, oh my gosh, that's really scary. What are we going to do? And this ends in a 13-day standoff where the world probably gets as close as we've ever been to nuclear war. So what happens is the United States puts nuclear missiles on a country that is pretty close to the Soviet Union, Turkey. Again, look it up on a map. I probably should have had a world map on here. And they're pointed at the Soviet Union, but they do so secretly. So the Soviet Union is like, okay, we found out that the US has these missiles here. We're going to put missiles on Cuba to retaliate and say, hey, if you're going to use those nukes against us, we're going to use ours against you. Think about that policy of brinkmanship that we talked about in the last notes. We're going to the brink of war here. And so the United States, they see that the Soviets are trying to put missiles on Cuba, and the president at the time, JFK, goes on national TV and says, stand down, or we're going to use our weapons. And it's this really scary time for Americans because they're like, are we going to go to nuclear war? And eventually both sides take their nuclear missiles down. So even though this didn't turn into a hot nuclear war, it did get really close. And I like to think of this as like the water is simmering, the water is boiling. There's a lot of tension there, showing that it's heating up. It's not just cold. Okay, next example we're going to look at the Vietnam War. Basically, Vietnam is another country in Asia. Again, look it up on the map. So basically, France had control of Vietnam, and then a leader in Vietnam, a guy named Ho Chi Minh, was like, we don't want to be under the French control. We want to have our own country when those waves of like nationalism were coming through. And they wanted independence. They didn't want a foreign country being in control of them. And so Ho Chi Minh was leaning towards democracy, but the United States was fearful that Vietnam would become communism, and they were like to the French, don't leave, you have to stay in control of them, we're afraid they'll become communists. The French say we can't fight them, so we're going to leave. And then the United States goes to war in Vietnam because they fear what's called the domino effect, that okay, we already have communism in that area. It's going to fall like dominoes. Other countries will become communist too. So the United States invades in Vietnam in order to get the communists out. And in the end, the United States loses almost 60,000 soldiers. Over 1.5 million Vietnamese people die, and Vietnam is still a communist country today. So Korean War ended in a stalemate, half communist, half not. Vietnam ends in a loss for the United States, both of lives, and Vietnam ends up being a communist country. So again, this is one of those proxy conflicts where the United States is not directly fighting the Soviet Union. However, they are fighting communism. So it's a hot war where we're fighting communism, proving that the Cold War, not that cold. Okay, last example is a Mideast country called Afghanistan. This is considered to be the Soviet Union's Vietnam. So in Afghanistan, they were also becoming more westernized, more like a democratic country. And while the United States was happy about that, the Soviet Union not so happy, because they wanted to spread communism and stop the spread of democracy, the opposite of what the United States wanted. So the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan in order to keep communism there. So exact opposite of why the US invades Vietnam. And the major religion of Afghanistan is Islam. Most people there are Muslims. They practice the religion of Islam. And communism is atheist. So the Muslim people were like, this communism doesn't fit with us. We're deeply religious. So they spent 10 years in guerrilla warfare trying to get the communist Soviet Union, Soviet troops out of Afghanistan, just like the Vietnamese were doing to the United States, guerrilla warfare tactics to get them out of their country. So, same end result. Basically, the Soviets in 1989 decided we can't keep Afghanistan under our control, and they left. And communism did not stay there. Instead, a group known as the Taliban takes power. They're an extreme Islamic group, jihadist group, and they gave refuge to Al Qaeda, a terrorist group, an Islamic terrorist group that planned and executed 9/11, the terrorist attack on the United States. And then the United States ends up invading Afghanistan because of that. So the Cold War has definite deep roots that still matter today, and that we're still fighting a war in that country that stems from the Cold War. But going back to our central question of the Cold War, why does Afghanistan prove that the Cold War wasn't that cold? Well, the Soviet Union was willing to invade a country, use troops, use actual hot fighting weapons in order to stop the spread of democracy and uphold communism. Okay, so those are your 4 examples that you could use to answer the essential question, why was the Cold War not that cold? You could also use anything we talked about in last week's notes too, like nuclear weapons and the Berlin airlift and the Berlin Wall. So kind of keep those things in mind as you think about how you're going to answer your essential questions for next week. Okay, that was our review. Now let's quickly go through the end of the Cold War. How does this decades-long conflict come to an end? Okay, so after Stalin, the next leader of the Soviet Union is a guy named Nikita Khrushchev, and he basically wants to purge the country of Stalin's influence. Stalin was a pretty awful guy who did a lot of damage and killed many Russian people, and he took down all the monuments to Stalin, and he tries to bring a little bit of peace to um, the Cold War conflict. However, he doesn't really do anything to help the satellite countries, the Eastern European countries that are forced to be a part of that Warsaw Pact with the Soviet Union. So during the 1950s and 60s, there's continuing protest movements in countries like Hungary and Czechoslovakia, where these people are like, hey, we don't want to be communists. We don't want to be a part of this communist. Look at over in the West, democracy, they're doing great. They've got booming economies, and we're falling behind. And the Soviet Union would not let them leave um, their Warsaw Pact and not let control of them go. Okay, jumping forward a little bit to the next decade, then the 1970s. 1970s, things are going to slowly move towards lessening tensions. We're going to see that brinkmanship that had been under U.S. presidents Eisenhower and Kennedy and Johnson. We're going to see that be replaced with Richard Nixon's policy of détente, where he is purposely going to say, okay, we're not going to go to the brink of war anymore. Let's not live under this like intense tension anymore. Let's bring it down a little bit. Nixon actually goes to a country that we didn't talk about that had become communist in 1949, which is China, kind of proving, okay, we're going to work with communist countries. We're not going to be like, everyone needs to hate them and not be their friend. Okay, so then we've got, after the 1970s, looking at what's happening in the 1980s, and just to kind of look ahead, the Soviet Union will fall in 1991, so we're getting close to the end now by the 1980s. So 1980s, we see Gorbachev become leader. He's going to be the last leader of the Soviet Union. He has this policy of glasnost, which means openness in Russian, and it's basically going to bring about some changes for people that's going to give them more freedom. They're allowed to criticize the government and not end up in prison. It's going to bring about some more rights for people, democratization, which means bringing more democracy to the country, and opening up the economy a little bit. So getting away from some of that strict communism. At the same time that Gorbachev is kind of lessening the control and communist elements of the Soviet Union, the United States elects a president, Ronald Reagan, who is extreme anti-communist and very much into military spending. So he is the most expensive military buildup in peacetime history. He puts lots and lots and lots and lots of money into building up the military, and the Soviet Union just couldn't compete with that. So it leads to some more arms control, some conferences. They're called SALT 1 and SALT 2, where they're going to make deals where they're like, okay, let's maybe not use have this huge nuclear weapon stock up, pile up that we've had in the past. Maybe that's not necessary. Okay, how does this conflict end? So basically, the forces for democracy are going to take over communism. That the people's desire for democratic reform is going to be really strong and ultimately going to lead to the breakup of the Soviet Union, and lots of those countries, hundreds of different ethnic groups calling for their own countries to be formed, much like what we saw with World War I and nationalism coming through, where people are like, hey, I'm not Russian, why should I be part of the Soviet Union? We want our own country and our own control. And that's ultimately what's going to happen. So Gorbachev was the last leader of the Soviet Union. Boris Yeltsin is the first elected president of Russia. So after 1991, the Communist Party is going to collapse. It's going to be the end of the Soviet Union. We don't call it the Soviet Union anymore. Now we're going to call it Russia, which is what we call it today. Okay, so that is the end of the Soviet Union. Let's watch this video clip that's going to go over this timeline and why the Soviet Union fell, and just kind of review with you the things that I highlighted. Whoops, that was not successful. Let's try that again.
December 25th, 2016 marks 25 years since the president of the Soviet Union resigned, leading to the end of the most powerful communist-leaning country in history. Although it stood as a major opposing force to the United States throughout the second half of the 20th century, the country's domestic struggles ultimately led to its downfall. So why exactly did the Soviet Union collapse? Well, the fall of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or USSR, can be said to begin with its last leader, Mikhail Gorbachev. He was in power from 1985 to 1991 and implemented a large number of reforms to try and deal with the growing unrest countrywide. Gorbachev entered office following what was called the Era of Stagnation, generally considered to cover the mid-1960s to the mid-1980s. Although the causes of this stagnation varied, they were largely based on economic, social, and military issues instituted during the reign of Leonid Brezhnev and several subsequent leaders. Although different theories have been proposed, one suggests that the Soviet Union was desperate to outperform the United States in two major regions, military and spaceflight. This led to excessive spending, with the Soviet Union establishing a self-contained military-industrial complex at the expense of the economy, leading to underproduction and stagnation. Moreover, after decades of repressive communist rule, domestic attitudes towards the government were at an all-time low, leading to greater dissent and unrest. As the new leader, Gorbachev quickly set out to reverse this stagnation through two massive programs unlike Russia had ever seen before. The first was called Glasnost, effectively meaning transparency. The Communist Party had long banned books, operated a secret police force against dissent, and arrested citizens for political disagreements. But Glasnost ended all of these practices and even tacitly encouraged new freedoms. The policy also made an effort to reduce the Communist Party's hold on the entire government, allowing competitive multi-candidate elections to occur. The next stage was called perestroika, or restructuring. This was an effort to move away from the structured economy run entirely by the state, allowing for more private ownership of businesses and semi-free market access. These two new efforts completely shifted the focus of Soviet politics and economy and closely mirrored the Western ideals that had made other countries successful. Unfortunately, the major shift was unable to undo decades of state rule, and in the words of Gorbachev, the old system collapsed before the new one had time to begin working, and the crisis in the society became even more acute. In this interim period, the economy got considerably worse, as did standards of living for nearly all members of the Soviet Union and its satellite states. Slowly, these Eastern European satellite states began to hold free elections, mostly as a result of the Glasnost reform. The first to shift away was Poland, whose newly free elections instituted a non-communist party and ultimately independence. Soon, other satellite states saw their own peaceful transitions of power. Eventually, these efforts led to widespread unrest throughout the government, and in August of 1991, a group of hardline Communist Party members attempted a coup d'etat against Gorbachev, who they believed was steering the country into failure. The coup did not work, and Gorbachev resigned as head of the Communist Party, which had tried to overthrow him. It was ultimately dissolved entirely. In the midst of the coup, several Baltic states announced their independence, which triggered a domino effect over the next few months. By December of 1991, Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Moldova, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan left the Soviet Union. They formed amongst themselves a new international commonwealth of independent states removed from the USSR. Within a few days, the now powerless USSR government, which technically only had power over Georgia, was dissolved by Gorbachev, ending 69 years of a world power. In the past 25 years, Russia has managed to somewhat recover its former glory, as the Russian Federation is the 13th largest economy in the world, boasting the second most powerful military. Although it is still lagging behind, Russia's resurgence as a global power is a testament to its influence before the fall of the Soviet Union. Russia has played a big role in many world conflicts.
Okay, so last thing here is our map of what the Soviet Union looked like after it fell. So we've got all of these little countries emerge around here that had been a part of the Soviet Union. So Russia loses a lot of its territory, which it's not going to be happy about. But all of these new countries gain their independence and get to form. So there you have it. The fall of the Soviet Union and end of the Cold War. So make sure that you are answering that essential question then. How can we in a short summary, like one or two sentences, say how the Cold War came to an end? Okay, guys, let me know if you have any questions. Send emails. I hope that you have a good week. And next week, we're going to wrap this up with your summative essential question: why the Cold War wasn't that cold.